That was one of the things I talked to the writer about, actually, because I was like, oh, here we go.
I'm the Education and Literature Manager at the Korean Cultural Center. Firstly, thank you all for being here today to the Korean Book Club in September. The Korean Book Club will cover a variety of Korean literary work, delving into various subjects with each edition. So I hope these events will allow you to understand our culture. So now I'd like to introduce two speakers, a very special guest from Korea, Sora who is a Korean-American translator, and Sydney-based interviewer and moderator Michaela Kowalski. Please give a big round.
Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be in the room and see people in front of us. What a delight. And you're in for an absolute treat this evening as well. Not only do you have an incredible translator and writer in her own right, but somebody who can also both tell us about Korean literature as it is today, as it's evolved both inside Korea and outside Korea, but also about this extraordinary book, The Whole, which we will talk about. I'm conscious that many of you may not have had the chance yet to read it, or if you have, I don't want to spoil it for anyone. So if we speak in funny abstracts, that's why. But it is a book that when you read, you will never be able to forget, which is, I think, the hallmark of great literature. In this conversation, we want to do a whole lot of things. And I wanted to start by talking with Sora, our wonderful guest, about the kind of the state of Korean literature. I think that's where we need to start in order to get a sense of where this book falls as well. What is the state of Korean literature, as you would describe it, inside Korea right now? Is there a great diversity? Where are we up to?
I would say it's quite robust and diverse. For a quote-unquote small country, there's a tremendous amount of literature and a lot of different kinds of literature. Like, I wouldn't necessarily say that The Whole is even representative, so to speak, of Korean literature. It's unique. The writer has a unique voice, and every book that I read, every writer that I encounter, it's like a whole new experience. So I find it very challenging to sort of boil down or try to summarize what Korean literature is, and it seems to be going even more in that direction of really, I don't want to say opening up exactly. That's not quite the metaphor that I want, but really encompassing more and more ideas, ways of writing, new stories. And along with that, the literature that's coming out in translation as well is, I think, reflecting that diversity more and more, especially as there's less pressure to sort of like represent the country, so to speak, to just sort of take risks on new books, new writers, young writers. Yeah, so I think I'm answering your question without really actually answering it.
And we should make the distinction that when we're talking about Korean literature, there are sort of two streams, really. There's literature that's being written by Korean authors who are inside Korea, but there's also this wonderful explosion and greater recognition of diaspora Korean literature. The state of that, are the stories that people are telling outside of Korea changing? How are they changing?
That's a really good question. I have to think about. I don't know that they maybe are changing per se, but I think the same sort of risk-taking, where you have, for example, say a Korean-American writer who doesn't write about Korea at all, and they're writing, there's no sort of just writing very freely without putting personal identity or story into it. But then there are also writers who don't live in Korea but are taking likewise a risk of writing about Korea and setting books and stories completely in Korea, which is a risk because there is, when you are a Korean American, or I assume it happens with Korean Australians, when you're from outside the country, there's a sort of like a different scrutiny that happens of, are you telling the story correctly, and who are you to tell this story? And I do see more of that, like with books like Pachinko. There's another really fabulous book called, I think it was If I Had Your Face, where it's written in English, but it's completely set in Korea. And when I read it, I thought this could have been written by a Korean writer. So there's a lot more of this sort of back and forth. And then at the same time, you have Korean writers who are likewise they are setting their books outside of Korea. So there's a lot more travel, which I find fascinating.
I was meant to say in my introduction that tonight will be a night of 1,000 great book recommendations. So many of you have your pens ready, but if you need to like type things into your phones, that's what we're going to get to tonight.
Or ask me later on Twitter and I'll...
Exactly. So I mean, you said before that there's a great range and diversity of the styles of fiction that are coming out of Korea, and I wondered as well if that also extends to the style of the writing and the tone of the writing, because this is a very interesting kind of tone of writing. And when I think about things like Kim Ji-young, born 1982,
Right.
as compared to something like The Vegetarian, those are
Right.
very different in style and tone. Can you talk about that range of style as well?
Absolutely, yes. There's the sort of more hard realist fiction. There's fiction that is sort of reaching back into like folklore and taking voices from there. There's genre-influenced writing, like Pan Hae-young. She, as far as I know, I mean, when I've spoken to her about it, she doesn't identify herself as a quote-unquote genre writer, but she has books that can be sold as crime fiction or as horror or in sort of different in these different categories. There are also a number of experimental writers, only a small number of whom have been translated, partly because experimental fiction has its own very unique and difficult challenges when you're translating that. There's one poet, Kim Min-jung, for example. The first time I read her in Korean, I thought, no way. Like, she would do things like it would just be a block of text and the sentences would just bleed into each other in a way that you can do with Korean, because Korean you don't actually have to use punctuation. You can just let things flow together. And I thought, no, impossible. No one's going to ever translate that. It's been translated. And I should name the translator, but I don't remember. So you'll have to look her up, Kim Min-jung. Yeah, so yes, there's so much happening with style.
Yeah. When I was listening to some interviews of you from years gone by, but in preparation for tonight, there was somebody who talked to you about this idea of Korean art or cinema as being kind of generally viewed as being a bit gloomy.
Oh, yes.
The kind of the doom and gloom.
Yes.
And I wanted to know if you agree with that assessment as somebody who lives in Korea, whether things have changed. I mean, you're very immersed in so many different kinds of kind of art practices. Is that a fair call?
I have pushed against it, and I feel like each time I push against it, I'm reminded of why that has been the impression. A part of me wants to say that unfortunately, sometimes it has been a failure of translation, because while there is doom and gloom, there's also a lot of dark humor.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the humor, the sort of like wryness that comes with that darkness doesn't always come through. It's really hard to translate, first of all.
Yeah.
I don't mean to put the blame on the translators. There are different reasons. I think another issue too is that up until recently there was this idea that literary fiction must be serious. You don't laugh, you don't joke, it has to be serious. And so jokes, even if they were there, like sexual humor, things like that, would sort of get cleaned up in the translation, whether intentionally or not. And I think for what was considered good intentions, but there are certain stories, even just from the title, there are certain stories where you look at it and go, okay, the writer was being really cheeky, but then it doesn't come through. And some of that too is just maybe certain symbolism doesn't, certain wordplay gets a little bit lost. So I think, like I said, I think some of that is the sort of lost in translation phenomenon that not all of it can be carried over. But the doom and gloom, I mean, there is reality to it, because if you look at Korean history, it hasn't been the happiest history. And if people are writing from those experiences, then of course
that's going to come into it.
It's going to come in.
And you lead us naturally into talking about translation, which is, a great gift in having you both to talk about the whole, but talk about how you brought it into an English language space, and you seem to have, from the reviews I've read of the book generally, you seem to have really preserved all of its so many different kinds of stories at the same time. It's a domestic thriller, it's about revenge, it's about tragedy, it's about lies, it's about class,
Right.
it's about, it's about family and family estrangement, and it's also it's horrifying. It's all those things simultaneously, and it's also kind of funny. Like, there are these moments where you do laugh, and the fact that you've been able to sort of bring that across says a lot about the nuance of your translation. So I want to speak with Sora now a little bit about translation, and then I promise we will get to the whole. Does someone set out to become a translator? How did you become a translator?
There are people who do. I have met people who they say that that's what they want to be and what they want to do, and I very often will tell them, no, please find another line of work. It's not really what you think it is. But then again, obviously I did it, and there is a way. For me, I did not. I don't know, like I was saying, I have said before in other conversations that I don't know that I fully realized that it was a job that one could do. Like I'm sure I had some vague idea that you would translate a book and get paid, but the idea that you would sort of do this continuously and get better at it and so on, that was quite new to me. So the way that I got into it is that I was doing my own writing, and I had this sort of vague idea that I had started out writing poetry, and I wanted to get better at writing fiction. And so I kind of thought, well, if I translate a story, if I take it apart and put it back together in another language, maybe I'll at the same time learn how to write a story. And then maybe I can figure out how to write my own story. But then what I discovered instead was translation as its own form of literature, as another form of writing, kind of like if you write poetry and then you discover like writing a sestina or writing, I don't know, limericks, like anything that has sort of rules and constraints. It became this new form of writing to me, and I got really kind of sucked into it, and now here I am.
Thank goodness.
10 years later, yeah. My own writing has suffered a little bit, but that's okay.
Yeah. Isn't that fascinating that it was a way of deconstructing story?
Right.
Yeah. When you come to a manuscript or a new novel, literally where do you begin?
Honestly, I approach a book just like any reader. I open it, I read the first few pages, and if I love it, then I know that I want to translate it. And that's pretty much it for me. The opening paragraphs will sell me one way or the other. Starting out, I was a lot more nervous about taking on projects, and I felt like I had to read the whole book. I had to be prepared. I had to know what challenges were going to come up, and I've learned that none of that matters. It's you know, are you going to fall in love with it in the first few pages, and that tells you everything.
And you need to fall in love with the book.
And you need to fall in love with it.
In order to bring it to life.
Yes.
Now, it's important, a little bit of background. You were not born in Korea.
Right. No, I was not.
Born in the US.
Yes.
But you now live in Korea.
Yes.
And I wondered if you've had any thoughts or reflections on how differently your translating of Korean fiction might be if you'd grown up in Korea.
Ooh.
Because you're bringing kind of a cross-cultural perspective, a little bit.
Yes. That's a very, well, I guess because I have taught translation in Korea, and so I could see among my students, I think the biggest advantage for me of having grown up in the US is that I grew up reading, obviously, literature in English. And above everything, what that gave me was a sense of what's possible in the language, like how you can push a language, what you can do. What I've seen with students sometimes is a little more hesitation, because they may have learned the language more in terms of like, here are the rules to follow, and here's the test you're going to take, and if you get this wrong, then you're bad at English, right? Which is really, that's not how we experience it out in sort of quote-unquote native speaker countries. I hate the phrase native speaker, but you know, I speak English very badly, basically. And part of what I bring into my writing is that sloppiness, I think. Oh, that sounds really, I can't believe I just said that out loud, but there's a...
We're all just going to disagree with you, but you're allowed to say what you'd like.
Well, I mean, there's a messiness, there's a play that you have to have with language, and I think if I had grown up in Korea and experienced English as more of like a test subject, like something that I had to excel at. And I will add that, like, if you live in Korea, there is a tremendous pressure to learn, not just learn English, but to learn it really well. Even if you don't need it in your daily life, you will need it for getting into schools, getting jobs. Even if your job maybe doesn't require English, it's a requirement. And so there is tremendous pressure to speak English well, which doesn't, like I said, it doesn't necessarily serve literature, because that's not exactly what happens.
It sounds like what you're describing is a playfulness with language.
Exactly.
That because you learned to speak it and you had all the lingo and slang and cheeky things that we learn to do when we're speaking the language we've grown up with.
Yeah.
Did you speak Korean at home? Did your mother speak Korean at home?
So what I like to joke is that my mother spoke Korean to me when she was angry at me. That was when I knew she was really mad, was when she switched from English to Korean, that I really messed up. So I did hear, I was exposed to the language growing up, but I unfortunately, like many people of my background, of my generation, I grew up in the generation where it was believed that a child should only speak one language or they'll be confused. And so I didn't formally start learning the language until college. And it wasn't really until I moved to Korea that I really felt I had a hang of it and could read books and feel it fully at home, beyond my childhood experiences of the language.
When it comes to Korean fiction, or in particular, Pyon's work, you mentioned before about things that can get lost in translation.
Sure.
And I wonder if there are particular things about the Korean language that, as you said, you talked about, the humor in the darkness. Sure. Are there other things that are pitfalls for you as a translator that you have to be alive to?
Absolutely. I mean, there are some, like, for example, Korean has different speech levels depending on who you're talking to. So if you're talking, for example, to your grandmother, there's a very different way of speaking than if you're talking to your friend, and it's built into the grammar in a very seamless way. And it creates, Korean writers can manipulate that in order to create different emotions, different meanings within a scene. And we don't have that in English, and so it has to be recreated. So there are things like that. Yeah, I mean, that's a big one. But also another thing that I like to talk about when I talk about challenges of translation is just like the textures of everyday life, like the way that we move through a space, the structure of spaces, the way that we live in Korea is not totally different, but it's just different enough that sometimes you'll go to translate something and realize that maybe you're sending the wrong message, or it's giving like an odd image. So there are all these like little things that are very hard to predict, but then you have to figure them out.
And reading is such an act of imagination that if you describe an apartment or a house, like in The Whole, I see a house that I know, but the house that I've grown up in Australia might be very different to the house you're describing.
Right.
I wondered as well, are you overly aware of the audience you're writing for?
I used to be, and then I learned how to sort of turn it off, because it was just too terrifying and overwhelming to try to, it's too many people to try to please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the case of Pyeon, who we're going to talk about in a moment, you've actually translated quite a lot of her work before, and you're working on her work now. And if we have time at the end, there's actually an excerpt from the new book, which is very exciting. But I wondered as well, have you spent time with her face to face?
I have, yes.
And how do you think that affects, knowing her voice, her everyday voice, how does that affect how you translate her writing voice?
Ooh, I would have to really reflect on that. Part of me wants to say that it doesn't affect it too much, because I think that for any book that I'm working on, I'm going to have my own relationship with it, and also just the characters. So Pyeongyang, if you ever have the opportunity, if you're ever lucky enough to meet her, she's very lovely. She's really nice. She's very soft-spoken. She's really pretty. She's nothing like the men in her books. And so it's kind of jarring.
She's got a lot of darkness.
Yes. But you would never guess it from meeting her. She is all lightness when you meet her. And so to go from like having coffee with her to then reading her book, it's jarring. It's a completely different voice, and it fascinates me that what comes out of her compared to if you just have coffee with her.
Yeah. So it doesn't sort of get in your way. It doesn't inform anything.
No, I don't know that it even could, because it's
so different.
Different. If anything, it would be that, gosh, I don't know. I mean, because I'm probably reaching too much. I mean, there's something sort of graceful about her, and so I guess I would want to keep some of that sort of grace in the work. But that said, I don't know how graceful Ogi is.
No, it sounds like her voice as a person and her voice as a writer are very different.
Yes, yeah.
Which is really interesting insight, I think. I think we need to get to The Whole. For people who haven't read it yet, can you give us a sense of the story and the characters?
Yes.
Without giving things away?
Well, I guess the simple way is to say how it opens. So this man named Ogi wakes up in the hospital and learns that he has been in a terrible car accident and his wife is dead. And he has no family. The only person left who is available to take care of him is his mother-in-law, who hates him. And that's the story.
And that is the story. Yep, exactly. I wondered, the book has been described, I described it that way as well, as a horror story. Would you agree?
I do, yes, I do, yes.
So I wondered as well when I was reading it that it seems to be a lot about revenge.
Yeah.
There's revenge even there are a lot of wonderful flashbacks, so you get a sense of the life of this married couple.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of kind of very petty things they do, sort of tit for tats, and ways they're kind of always balancing out their power with each other. And it felt like it was, and in revenge there is a lot of horror, because revenge goes very wrong, and it does in this book. It goes very wrong in very extreme, visceral ways. But I wondered as well how you managed to weave in, as you talked about before, the everyday life of aspects of an aspect of a story that you have to weave in, the size of an apartment, or the way someone would open a door, or how life is, or how the weather is. How do you weave in this extraordinary kind of this horror revenge stream with really kind of a domestic thriller, the pettiness of this marriage as well? How did you sort of find that balance? Was that easy because it came from her writing? How did you strike that balance in English?
I would actually, well, to be fair, I would probably have to go back in time and ask the me that was working on the book, like, is this easy? How are you doing? But I would say that it was kind of easy for a couple of reasons. One, it was there in the book. She did the work. I didn't have to fight it very much at all. I mean, there were a couple of scenes that were a struggle, and I think it's even apparent from the translation when you see what I did with it. I think you can, and I can mention it as well. But I'm also a big fan of horror literature in general. Like as a genre, and when we talk about genre fiction, we tend to be a little bit reductive in the way that we talk about it. But what I love about horror is its potential for philosophy and for commenting on our lives in a way, in unexpected ways, I guess I'll put it that way. And for me, the book was deeply philosophical on top of being really horrific. And
it is, it's deeply philosophical about everything. I mean, even the title, The Whole, comes to mean 15 different things by the middle of the book.
Yes, and funny you mentioned that. So the challenge is, so the Korean title is also Hol.
I was going to ask.
It's wordplay. So Hol in Korean is a prefix that means alone, and you use it to form the word like a widow. I think you can also make the word orphan out of it. But it also can just be a hole, like a literal hole in the ground. And so when it went to the publisher had sent it back with the whole, and I was like, could we maybe drop the? Like, what happens if it's just whole? And then there was this whole weird long conversation that ensued over this one word. But so there was the title, which was wordplay, but then there's also a passage in there where she uses this term chagi, which has 3 different meanings. It can mean oneself, it can mean pottery, it can mean like honey. And it was such I ended up just leaving the word in Korean and adding in what we call a gloss, like an explanation of it, because I could not find a way to recreate that wordplay in English where it would have 3 different meanings. And it's something that she's very fond of, is using words with multiple meanings in her work.
And that's fascinating about the title, because when you read the book as well, the idea of alone and orphan, and what was the other meaning? Orphan and...
that was it.
Yeah, and widow, orphan and widow,
widow,
are kind of slights that are thrown around in the book, because the man who's in a coma is in effect an orphan, but one of his mother committed suicide, which is, I'm not spoiling anything. So there's a lot of shame that his mother-in-law always throws at him about that. So it's fascinating to know that there was all of that in the title in Korean that we don't get in English. Yeah. Can we talk about the way that Pyun writes men and masculinity in particular? He's not a sympathetic character. There's a lot of pain that he's going through, a lot of pain that he's caused, and yet you feel for him, but he's also despicable. Can you talk about how she does that?
Yeah, she does. She seems quite fond of this in her stories. I think almost everything that I have translated by her has these types of men, these sort of toxic men who they probably think they're very well intentioned. They probably think that they're living their lives the way that they should, the way that they were taught they should, but they're hurting people and they're hurting themselves. And just sort of blundering through. And I had talked to the writer about this choice, because the other aspect of her books is that there's sort of a coldness to the prose, and some people have commented on it as well in the Korean, that there's something very, well, in Korean I want to say like dakdake. There's something a little bit hard about the way she writes. The sentences it's not this sort of like fluid lines rolling into other lines kind of feeling. It's
almost staccato or
yeah, exactly.
abrupt.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah.
And I had asked her about that, and she commented. And in addition, there's also always a sense of distance, that the what we call the narrative distance, that the voice that is telling the story is sort of like up here, and the character is down here. And she had said that basically she doesn't like these men, so she wants to sort of keep them far away from her as well. Like almost like she doesn't want them too much in her own head, which I thought was really interesting. And yet she writes them over and over again. Yeah.
And that's a really interesting point, though, about the distance from the character, because it seems to be her style.
Right.
Because there's also, from a reader's perspective, there are, you know, he wakes up in a hospital and he can't move his body, and it's a terrifying idea of he can think and he knows he's alive and he knows his wife is gone, and he can hear his mother-in-law weeping and he can't move, he can't do anything. And if you were too close to that character, it would be almost unreadable.
Right.
You know, everything he has to go through, the pain, his physical pain and physical therapy he goes through, and then other, you know, degradations sort of showered upon him by people who are nominally taking care of him.
Yes.
I want to, while we just talked about the men, I want to talk about the women in this book as well, but in particular the wife.
Yeah.
So the wife is not given a name.
Yeah.
We don't know her name, and she's very flawed. And Oggy loves her anyway. Yeah. She's contradictory. She's shallow. She sort of resigns herself to failure and loss. And I wondered if the way that she's depicted, in particular, she wants to be well known for something, and it doesn't much matter what. You know, her desk in their house isn't photos of them or the photos of her family. It's photos of other famous, often Western women. Yeah. You know, it's Oriana Fallaci, or it's you know, it's Annie Leibovitz, or it's Princess Di. It's just women she aspires to be. Yeah. Is that a comment about that kind of class of women, or do you think it's a character study?
Oh, I think it could be both, because there is so much about class in the story, about this sort of they're comfortable, but they're aspiring to be more. They feel this pressure to be more, and to do well and to be famous, and it's maybe never going to happen for them. And class is a recurring theme in Pan Hae-young's work as well. And the wife, I too found it really fascinating and very tragic, because like you said, all she wants is to be known for something, but she doesn't even have a name. And that too, when I had asked the writer about it, she said it was deliberate, that she wanted this person to only be known through her relationships to other people. She's never fully her own person.
And there are great depictions. I was going to say as well, the book is, you know, it's a horror story in the literal sense, but it's also a horror story because it's a very unhappy marriage. It's a very bleak depiction of marriage, full stop. It does not give marriage a good name. Marriage seems, you know, highly transactional and very sort of ticker box, like it's just something you do at a certain age, not something there's no suggestion of great connection or of great love.
That's true. Though they did once call each other Chagi. They did,
that's true.
They had terms of endearment.
Yeah, they did. That's true. As we said, you've translated quite a lot of Pyun's work, and I wonder, are there themes or visuals that she returns to in her writing?
Yes. So these despicable men definitely come back. The sort of victimized women, which was something we had there was another interesting conversation that I had with her about that, like because there was a time where that was becoming, not that it's a continuing conversation, right? Like if we only depict women as victims, like what does that do, and how can we kind of write stories differently? And she as well was sort of, I think at some point reflecting on that and looking at her own female characters that she was creating. So one of her other books, The Law of Lines, the main characters are two women, and I kind of think that may have been her way of going, okay, let me step away a bit
from these men.
From this usual pattern to talk about these other men. But there are definitely recurring images. Like another thing I find fascinating about Pan Hae-young's world is her treatment of the natural world. So I think everything I've worked on by her, there's some point where a character encounters nature in some way. So like with Oggy, there's a scene where there's a moment where his wife is planting vines on the back of the house, and he has very strong thoughts about this. In another book, there's a character who gets attacked by monkeys while walking through a jungle, and then the book that I'm working on right now, it's former lumberjacks who are living in this tiny forest village, and you would think that maybe they'd feel at home there, but they're all afraid of this forest that they used to work in. And so I find over and over again the sense of the natural world as this, was it Hobbes? It was like man versus nature, right? Like nature is this awful, horrible place that's going to come and get you. But it seems particularly targeted at the men, that somehow the men are like on the verge of being consumed by the natural world around them.
And in other cultures, the natural world is seen as Mother Earth.
Yes.
And I wondered if for Pune it was a battle between the idea of kind of women consuming men, or if it's just, as you say, the natural world, like a lack of order.
I want to go with the first one, that this is,
women consuming men.
Yeah.
Fantastic. When we were talking before, we were also talking about the mother-in-law, who we haven't sort of come back to. She represents a different generation.
Yeah.
But there's something really powerful about her that I wanted to ask you about. There's a big preoccupation in the whole about people who are foreigners, who are either mixed race or who are not Korean enough. The mother-in-law is part Japanese.
Yes, so she's Japanese and Korean, which is particularly, I guess we could say, touchy mix in Korea, because of course, if you know your Japanese history, Korea was colonized by Japan. And so there is this sort of adversarial relationship, a hostility between Korea and Japan that continues. And so for her to be half Japanese, she's never going to be Korean. She's never going to be family. She's never going to belong there.
And there are all these moments in the book where when Ogi doesn't understand something she does, he says, well, it's because she's a foreigner.
Yeah.
He doesn't think maybe she thinks differently to him or she's of a different generation.
Right, it's not because they're different individuals.
It must be because she's strange.
Yeah.
And more broadly than just the foreigner thing, it becomes a sort of a treatise almost on who is a stranger to us.
Yes.
And I wondered if that's without trying to draw too wide a bow, is that what kind of preoccupation that is in Korea about the stranger
certainly.
and the foreigner?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something for me as a biracial Korean American. I experience it all the time. It's you're one or the other. You're Korean or you're not. And like, I'm not Korean in Korea, even though I have family there and I have, I have relatives who are buried there. I would never.
It's not that you're not
be
Korean enough, you're just not Korean.
Oh, okay. Well, that depends who I'm talking to.
Yeah.
For some people, there would be people who are like, yeah, okay, you're Korean enough. But in general, what I've experienced is a very sort of black or white kind of dichotomous approach to things, and not just targeted at mixed people. It's just general. Even you could be a full-blooded Korean American, but if you didn't grow up in Korea, then no, you're not gonna be Korean enough because you haven't lived there enough. And then it gets even more granular too. Like for men, you have to go through the army, and there's that sort of rite of passage. So there's certain experiences that you do genuinely have to have had by living in Korea as a citizen. So yeah, I mean, that could be a whole nother interview. It was like, who gets to be Korean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I should say as well that some of Sora's writing, which you can find linked to her website, is in an anthology of essays on mixed race, on being a mixed race person, an insider outsider, which is really fascinating. And I meant to say at the beginning that we will have time at the end of our conversation tonight for your questions. So I hope you've kept them in mind as we're going along, and there'll be time for questions for people who are watching online as well, which will be wonderful. And also, obviously, we're talking about the whole, and I didn't get to say at the beginning that you would have been given a raffle ticket at the beginning when you came in, and 6 lucky people will get a copy of the whole, and we'll draw that raffle at the end of our conversation. I wanted to ask about translator regret. I mean, you're talking about there's so much that you're thinking about, that you're weaving in, that you're challenging with editors, with other people. But is there anything in this book where you regret a choice that you made now that you have the distance and you can read it?
There were a couple. The Chagi thing, that was a compromise that I made, and I had actually at one point considered taking it out, because I tried a version where I just took out the wordplay entirely, and it made for a very, very clean read. But then when I showed it to someone who had already read the full book, I had them reread a passage, and they pointed out that it took away some of the nuance of the relationship, that it is such an uncomfortable, unloving relationship. But then they said, well, look, if you take away the fact that they once liked each other enough to call each other a term of endearment, then like what does that leave? Then why were they ever together? And so then I knew like I had to keep it in. But there's always that little like, oh, I wish there had been a better solution. The other one though, you know, we were talking about like men and toxic masculinity, and I had mentioned the scene of vines. So there was this scene that I got very stuck on this word where he is talking about, so Oogie for some reason really hates climbing plants. He hates vines, he hates things that will like cling to a wall and grow up them. And his wife, and he tells his wife, he forbids her to plant any of these in their yard. Oh, and this is another aspect of the story, is they have bought a townhouse with a yard, which if you know anything about Korea, like that's pretty good money. Like they're not just living in a flat or an apartment, they've got a house with a yard. So they're aspiring, right? They're trying to move up in the world. But he lays this law down that no climbing plants. And so what she does is she sneaks around to the back of the house where he never goes and plants them in the very back, where he won't see them. And it becomes significant later when he's bedbound because they're very slowly climbing over his window, and one of my favorite scenes. But so anyway, so there's this long passage where he's contemplating these plants and wondering like, what is it within them that gives them this power to climb the wall like that? And he used the word, or the writer rather, used the word tokada to describe like the strength or tenacity of these plants. And I got really stuck on this word. I really wanted a better way to translate it. And I think I went with tenacious, which I wasn't crazy about. And it wasn't until much later that I was talking about the book somewhere else, and I mentioned how tok can also mean like poison or like a toxin. And it was in this context of talking about the masculinity of the book, and I thought she put it right there, like toxic masculinity, like this phrase that is being thrown around and talked about, and so I was like, now I want to go back and redo that, like this moment, like what is it that he's feeling about these plants and this sort of like poison ivy, right, that is growing in his life. So yeah, that was my regret. It was like I wanted to go back and just
add that
squeeze a little more meaning in. Yeah.
And there's a lot of meaning in already.
Yeah.
And you referred to the garden, the wife whose name we don't know, when they move into this house, initially they use the front section of their garden as a kind of place to have guests over and have barbecues. And then after a barbecue where she feels a bit left out, his friends come over and they're all drinking and they're from grad school and she just feels a bit on the outer. She destroys the barbecue and bans any barbecuing from taking place in the front garden, and she takes it over.
Yes.
And then her whole preoccupation, she doesn't really work anymore. She was writing a book. Everything she picks up as a project she discards. She can't sort of see anything through. And she really becomes committed to this garden, to this, to planting seeds and to understanding the soil. And the first year the garden fails, and it's probably the only thing, interestingly, that she's committed to.
Right.
And now I'm thinking about the way that Pyun writes about nature kind of destroying men, and I'm wondering about the significance of the garden.
Me too, yeah, me too. This is one of the fun things about translating is, even when I say like translation regret, it doesn't mean that would have been the right translation or a better translation. These are just the things that stay with us and that we obsess over. And I have so many questions as well, and when I talk to the writer, I'll ask her questions and kind of get answers that satisfy, but then there's always more. And I think that's also why I keep wanting to translate her work, is because I do find it fascinating, like trying to figure like what's going on in your head. What is this strange world?
I wanted to ask you about something, because you mentioned before our conversation tonight, it was something that's contemporary, that's happening in Korea, but that a lot of the book, the Ogi spends in a bed, and he's disabled, and some people treat him well at the hospital, but most people treat him very poorly. They tell him that he's a cripple, they tell him he takes up space, they tell him that he's useless, or they actually really seriously maltreat him. And I wondered if that was, you mentioned that there had been some protests happening in Korea, and I wondered if, in the book he's a very unsympathetic character, and yet you really feel for the deprivation that he's experiencing as a person who's disabled. Can you talk about those parallels a bit?
Yeah, well, and to be fair, I don't know how much the writer had this in mind when she was working on it, but rights and accessibility for disabled people is a serious issue in Korea. There was recently a protest. So Seoul has this fabulous subway system. Just everybody sings its praises, but it's not as accessible as it could be for people in wheelchairs, or for moms with strollers, for that matter, as I've as I've learned. Like I used to think it was just the most amazing thing, and now that I'm often behind a stroller, I'm like, this is actually not that easy to use. And so anyway, so more to the point. So one of the ways that people will protest this is by putting their wheelchairs down onto the tracks at rush hour or whenever to stop the trains, and to make the point that like, you can't ride, well, we can't ride either, to really drive home the point of what's happening. And this protest has happened before as well. I think when I first moved to Korea around 2002, it had either, I might be really wrong on my dates here, and I apologize for that, but I think that it had, a similar protest had just happened, or happened maybe right after I got there. And when it happened again recently, I just kind of felt like, like it again, like how many times do people have to like put their lives
Literally on the
literally, yeah, before people listen. And I mean, there are so many things as well. With schools as well, it's always a struggle for like parents with disabled children to try to get accommodations in classrooms. The parents of other students will complain that those students are getting special favors. So there's all sorts of, there's lots of, as in every country, this is by no means a Korea only problem. As in every country, there are the treatment of disabled people, elderly people, people just with chronic illness. There's so much work that needs to be done.
We have the same issues in Australia.
Yeah.
Listening to you speak this evening, it makes me not remember, but realize that a lot of this book is about power.
Yes.
Who has it and who doesn't, and who withholds it and why. And I wondered if, again, not to make it all about that, but if those are kind of zeitgeist cultural things in Korea.
100%, yes. Who wields power, who is subject to power, absolutely. There's even, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and does that run, is that a theme in other books by Pyun?
By Pyun and by other writers, I think it's very much a driving concern, the abuses of power that continue to happen. Yeah.
We're almost at the point for your questions, but I want to ask Sora just one or two more before we come to yours. I think from my understanding that you didn't study writing, you kind of came to writing.
Yes.
And I guess I want to ask you, you've got such an amazing facility and gift for bringing other stories into another version for people to read across language. Exactly. You've done good. I guess why were you drawn to writing as a child? Like, were you a child who was always dreaming up books?
Oh, I was absolutely a bookworm. I started reading very early and just always had my nose in a book. I think sometimes when I think back on childhood memories, I remember stories first, or I remember books that I read at the time. So I was always drawn to literature and to wanting to live in other worlds. So for me, it felt very natural and kind of, in a way, obvious, I guess, when I realized, like, maybe I want to do my own writing. Because even then, I wasn't the kind of kid who was, actually, no, I've been told that I wrote stories when I was very little. I just don't remember. But it wasn't until later in high school that I started writing poetry and wanted to, and found that, I guess, form of expression for myself.
Do you remember what some of those books were that stopped you in your tracks as a young reader?
I think one of my favorite, that's an embarrassing question, but okay. Like, one of my favorite books as a kid was called The Wizard Children of Finn, which was about these presumably two Irish-American kids who find out that their father was actually an ancient Irish warrior and that their mother had traveled through time.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Genre. You said you like genre fiction.
I do like genre fiction, yeah. So that's one that I think about a lot.
Yeah. When you started reading Korean fiction, who were the writers who really spoke to you, who really jumped out at you?
One of the very first writers who jumped out at me was a writer named Bang Min-gyu, who is very funny and writes in this very sort of fantastical way. I have translated some of his short fiction, but not his long fiction. He has, for example, one of the stories that I did, I don't know why I'm blanking on the title. It has giraffe in the title. I should remember. But the main character's father goes missing and then reappears one day in the subway as a giraffe. Or at least he thinks it's his father. At any rate, there's a giraffe, and so he's pretty sure that it's his dad. So very odd little stories like that.
Absurdist, almost.
And he really should be in translation, and I know other translators who are working on him, so I fully expect to see his work available in the future.
If there are people with us tonight or people watching tonight who haven't yet had the joy of diving into Korean literature, where do you recommend they start?
Oh, it's really, that is one of the hardest questions for me because there is so much available. It really depends so much on what you already like to read. So for example, if you were new to Korean literature, then I would ask, like, what are your favorite books? Like, do you like graphic novel? Do you like sci-fi? Do you like horror? And then I would recommend something. Or do you just like straight ahead, like realist literary fiction? I would recommend a title. If you want to get just little like previews or samples, I can recommend an online resource, Korean Literature Now. It's published by the Literary Translation Institute of Korea. And what they do is they will publish excerpts from books and short stories. It's free, you just have to register. That is kind of what I've resorted to because I don't know, because I would have to know more about you, which is the fantastic thing. There's so much available now in translation.
Yeah. And I want to ask you as well, we mentioned that you grew up in America, but that you've been in Korea now for a number of years. I think you said 15 years. Why did you move back?
To Korea?
Yeah.
Why honestly,
did you move to Korea?
Yeah, when I first moved, I wanted to get better at the language. I wanted to spend time with my relatives. My mom was the only one who immigrated, and so my entire Korean family is in Korea. And I wanted to, spend time with that side of my family. And I thought, I'll spend a year or two there, experience Korea, and then go back. But then it was during that time that I discovered translation, and it made sense to stay. And for all of its flaws, it's a really great place to live. Yeah.
And we mentioned before that you're working on a new book by Pyun, which I think is called, the translation is The Owl Cries.
Yes, The Owl Cries.
Can you tell us a little bit about what it's about, or could you read us the excerpt?
Yes. We're okay on that?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's kind of a horror mystery, although I don't even want to say that because it would almost set up too many expectations. And that's the tricky thing with any genre. Genre has certain expectations to it. And with Pyun, you kind of have to abandon that. You have to go, it's like horror, but it's not going to be like horror novels that you've read. So this book, it's like I said, it's set in a forest. Everybody has secrets. I'm still in the middle of translating it, and I translate as I read, so I don't even know yet what all the secrets are.
You translate as you read?
Yes, I translate as I read. Or I read as I translate.
Yeah.
And it starts like many of Pyun's books. Someone has gone missing, and a relative has gone in search of that person. And so this little passage that I chose, there's a man named Park In-soo. He's a forest ranger, though he really has no qualifications to be a forest ranger. He has zero training. He was just sort of handed this job. He's in this sort of office or ranger station. It's like set at the entrance to the forest. And so I'll just go ahead and read. Okay. With the lights out, the office was as dark and quiet as a dock on a moonless night. Each time the wind blew, a ferocious wail wrapped around the building. The forest had turned into an enormous creature bellowing out its grief. The windows and doors rattled mercilessly as if someone was out there, begging to be let in. Park In-soo locked the door. The forest had become one with the darkness and was encroaching upon the sky, the ground, the air itself. In-soo turned his eyes away from the shadowy trees. He'd grown sick of the woods already. No, not sick, scared. Each time he looked out at the forest from inside the office, he felt the forest was watching him. Watching him? That was impossible. He knew that it was, and yet every time the trees let out an eerie creak with each gust of the wind, or the birds cried out and hurled their bodies into the air, or he heard the voices of creatures he'd never seen before, or sounds he couldn't place, his body went rigid with anxiety. He felt as if the dense air, the trees huddled together, the howling birds in the underbrush that shook in the wind, and the animals and insects of every shape and stripe, engrossed in their own propagation, had trapped him there in that temporary enclosure and were studying his behavior, his habits. That feeling came from the fact that the forest was always in the majority. The forest was a crowd of countless trees, birds, insects, weeds, small mammals, and fungi. When the wind blew, no single tree swayed alone, but rather an army of trees swayed, causing the weeds and fungi to shake too, and flocks of birds to take flight until, at last, the entire forest moved as one. A forest was a plurality and a totality. Meanwhile, he was alone. When the wind blew, he pulled his jacket around him tighter, and when he heard strange, eerie sounds, he plugged his ears. And when the forest cast shadows, he had no recourse than to endure it with only the overhead fluorescence to hold the darkness at bay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. What a great treat. We now have time for your questions in the room. If there are questions, if you want to pop your hand up, we'd love to hear from you. Any questions for Sora? It's always hard to be the first question. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much. It was really interesting and really insightful. I was wondering, when you translate, do you sometimes feel like you have a favorite character? Does it ever interfere with you translating something in the way it should be translated? You know what I mean? When you're kind of you're watching a movie and you're cheering for someone.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you have to kind of hold back a little bit to kind of go back to what the actor intended?
I guess I do think about that. Like I mentioned at the beginning, humor, and that's something where, well, I mean, that's not quite answering your question, but there are times where to bring it back to your question, there are times where I kind of stop and go, am I reading this the right way? Or am I, for example, if I think a character is really funny, like, are they actually funny, or is that just me? Or vice versa. But to some extent, honestly, you kind of have to let go of that when you translate, because it's sort of impossible to, like, I can't become her, and then I can't become the readers well enough to know, like, how can I translate this in a way that's going to, like, perfectly deposit it into your head. So it's like you try really hard, and then at some point you just let go and know that, like, yeah, that it's a translation. There was another book that I had worked on where I felt like, I was like, oh yeah, I did it. I got it the way the author meant it. And then the first thing he said to me was like, wow, you really made it your own. And he meant it in a nice way, but I was like, a little bit of me felt crushed, like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought I channeled you, but okay, yeah.
So it's a little bit of almost a backhanded compliment, almost. But you say it was a gift from him.
Yeah, he meant it very nicely. Yeah, it was. I wouldn't say that it was backhanded.
Yeah.
It was kind of like he was intrigued by what I had added to it, whereas I thought, oh, I didn't add anything.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So like I said, yeah, I've learned to just let go of that concern. Yeah.
Are there other questions for Sora? Thank you.
Thanks for a great talk.
Oh, thank you.
So speaking of this word play, I was wondering about this main character's name.
Yes. Yeah.
It's, like Jackie, or like relating to that vibe, that toxic masculinity. So this Ogi name has its own meaning.
Yes, it has its own meaning. It's. I'm trying to think of what the right word in English would be. It's not stubbornness exactly, but kind of stubbornness, right? Like or resilience. Yeah, his name it has a meaning as well.
Okay.
Yeah. And
wow.
Yeah, she likes to do that. She loves to hide meanings in names. There's another book where a character's name means not there. So, and there's always this balance of like what you hope that the sense of it comes through, that you at least get it like from the character's portrayal, for example, or from somewhere else in the book, even if the name itself doesn't deliver that meaning. But there's always that like I wish that there were a simpler way to get it across to the reader. Yeah.
Fantastic. Are there other questions from Sora? Thank you.
Reading the book, I felt that the language is very precise and exact. Is that something that I guess helped you in the translating of the work, or is it somehow a bit constrained as well?
Yeah. It was definitely something. Well, when I read Pan, her language feels very precise to me. It feels very deliberate, and I can see places where she is clearly thinking about the way that certain verbs work and the way certain words sort of like, work together. And so I did strive for that in the translation, to sort of pull out anything extraneous and have it be very, like little Lego pieces stuck together.
Are there questions from online? Oh, thank you. Fantastic. Okay. So these are questions from people who are streaming with us this evening. What do you wish people knew about translation? It's a great question.
What do I wish people knew about translation? Oh, where do I begin? What I wish people would know when they read books is that everything you read on the page is not from us alone. That there are, for every, authors have different degrees of involvement in a book. Pyongyang is pretty hands-off. She will answer my questions, but she is never like, no, you need to do it this way. Only very occasionally will she sort of weigh in, especially like with titles, to say like, well, I would like it to be this way. But she's very trusting in that respect. But there are other authors who will be more, like they will look over the drafts, for example, or they will have certain ideas or directives. But more than that, more than the writer, there are editors. A published book has always been edited. It has always been looked at by multiple sets of eyes. And in most cases, these are editors who are not reading the Korean. They're treating it as a book in English. And their choices are informed by that, by their reading of the text, and also to a certain degree, the ability to market the book. So I see a lot of situations, for example, where translators will get flack for the title of a book that we don't actually have control over. Mm-hmm. Like we can have a say, like we can try to influence and nudge that discussion, but quite often the titles are decided by someone other than us, weirdly, right? So that's what I would want readers to know, is that it's yes, the bulk of it is my work, and I do my best to advocate for the writer when they have preferences, to advocate for the book as I understand it, but it's never a solo act. It's always a collaboration.
Mm. Another great question that came in from people who are watching online: what other translators have inspired you, and also any other books that you'd recommend people to read?
What other translators have inspired me? Ooh,
it's a good one.
It's a good one and a dangerous one. Gosh, I think, and of course I'm going to do the thing that always happens where my mind is going to blank on names. There are so many that have inspired me, and I have taught translation before, and I'm endlessly inspired by the people that I've had in my classes and workshops and who have gone on to translate. I learn as much, probably more from them than I've ever taught them. And I think I'm very excited about the new translators, the emerging translators who are translating Korean literature, because I see them taking risks and doing things that I would have been timid about when I was starting out. So I would say that that's who I am inspired by, are all the new translators bringing Korean literature into English. And then the other question was...
more books you'd recommend people to read? And they didn't specify whether they were, I'm assuming we're talking about Korean books.
Okay. So many books. There are a ton available now. Gosh, where do I begin? Well, if you follow any like the Man Booker Prize stuff, so we have Love in the Big City, we have Cursed Bunny, those are amazing books. What else? A very simple way actually to follow amazing work in translation would be to follow the Smoking Tigers. They have a Twitter account and a website. These are emerging translators. Smoking, like tigers, smoking pipes. Smoking Tigers, just look it up and you'll find them. Anything that they're doing, I 100% recommend. There is really fascinating work being done with queer literature, with gender fluid literature, coming out of Korean. I don't know if it's in publication yet. There's a book called Customer that I've been really sort of eagerly awaiting, that I think should be being translated by a translator named Victoria Cottle. She's one of the Tigers, so you can look for her. Love in the Big City is another a queer love story. What else? Gosh. I'm going to be kicking myself later because of all the names and titles that I can't remember.
But you could tweet them and then people can follow you on Twitter.
And there's Korean Literature Now. For Korean American, for quote-unquote diaspora fiction, one book I'm really excited about is called Skullwater by one of my favorite writers. He's a fellow mixed-race Korean American. He grew up in Korea, and his first book was called Memoirs of My Ghost Brother, which was about his childhood in Korea. And his sequel to that, Well, I shouldn't say it's about, it was, what does he call it, like auto-fiction? It's
Yeah.
like fiction, but yeah. So the sequel to that is coming out next year, and I'm really, really excited to read it.
And what's his name, sorry?
Heinz Insu Finkel.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions in the room for Sora? And then we're going to draw a raffle, and then we're going to wrap up. But should we draw a raffle quickly? Let's do that. I think I get to choose 3. Thank you very much. What a beautiful box. It's very exciting. 35, C35. C41. I never get to do this in an interview. This is fantastic. And C43. They're not together.
Okay. Let's see. C28. No 28. 18. Oh, okay. And 36.
Fantastic. Extra treat. Well, I want to say an enormous thank you to everyone who came this evening to hear Sora Kim Russell. An enormous thank you to the Korean Cultural Centre for this fantastic opportunity. And I should say as well that The Whole is a book, if you haven't picked it up yet, that will really stay with you. It's brilliantly constructed, it's lean, it's terrifying. At the very heart of it, I think, hearing you speak tonight, it reminded me it's about what it means to love, to be alone, to be close to someone, to die and to live, and what it means to experience life. And thank you to you for bringing it to all of our attention in English as well.
Oh, thank you.
Please join me in thanking Sora Kim Russell.